Two high school friends scam billionaire boys to become rich, but things get deadly as they try to hide their crime. Let's see how long they can continue fooling everyone. In the opening scene, we meet a boy named Dean Carney. He lives in Los Angeles with his middle-class family. Dean's parents want him to have the best opportunities, so they send him to a prestigious school called Harvard High School. Dean knows how to pretend to be wealthy to fit in with the rich kids at school. At Harvard High, Dean becomes friends with a student named Joe Hunt. Joe is also from a middle-class family and attends the school on a scholarship. However, Dean is outgoing and sociable, while Joe is introverted. Later, 6 years after graduating in July 1983, Dean comes to a cafe to sell a luxury car to one of his rich friends. Surprisingly, he sees Joe there and approaches him. During their conversation, they tell each other about their lives and Joe tells him that he is working as a salesman in a stock exchange company. On the other hand, Dean just relies on his rich friends to make a living out of their money. However, he advises Joe to have his own business, but Joe tells him that he doesn't have good connections with people to convince them to invest. Suddenly, Dean has an idea and proposes that they team up. Then, he explains that he has many connections with rich people and believes they can be successful together. Moreover, Dean invites Joe to a costume party hosted by a wealthy kid named Charlie. Joe is initially hesitant because Charlie and his friends didn't like him in school, but he eventually agrees to go with Dean. To make matters worse, Kyle recognizes Joe and announces to everyone that he was one of the nerdy students from Harvard. Joe freezes at that moment, and everyone ignores him. Feeling hopeless, Joe returns home and sits on the sofa, watching TV. As he glances at the table, he notices a magazine that tells the success story of Steve Jobs. As Joe reads it, he becomes inspired and spends the whole night making a strategy. The next day, he represents his new plan in front of Dean and explains that rich people don't care about investment techniques but just want to be part of something big that can give them recognition. After reading Joe's strategic plan, Dean is impressed and hands him over the $10,000 he received from Kyle as an apology. He is confident that Joe will be able to double this money soon. Moreover, Joe informs Dean that they will name their company BBC, which Dean agrees to. Afterwards, Joe decides to invest Kyle's money in gold stocks, and within 3 weeks, they make a profit of about 35%. In the next scene, Joe and Dean go to Charlie's house to share their success with him. Meanwhile, Dean makes a stop to deliver a set of expensive car wheels to a wealthy man named Ron Levin, who used to work as a stock trader and knows about the commodities market. While Dean and Ron are talking, Joe takes a moment to read the newspaper and is shocked to see the news of a sudden decline in gold stock prices. Ron notices Joe's expression and realizes that Joe has suffered a loss. However, Joe tries to change the topic and stay calm. Nevertheless, Ron offers Joe valuable advice, stating that the perception of reality is often more impactful than reality itself. Afterwards, they go to Charlie's house, and in the restroom, Joe informs Dean that they have lost 50% of the investment. Thus, he decides to return the remaining $5,000 to Kyle as he wants to be honest with him. However, Dean reveals that Kyle was unaware that he had given Joe the money to invest. This revelation angers Joe, but Dean tries to convince him, saying that taking risks is necessary to become successful and that this is how legends are born. Then Dean begins the presentation in front of Charlie, Kyle, and their friends and asks Joe to explain further. Lost in his thoughts, Joe looks at the record of losses and finally decides to lie by changing the figures to make them appear as gains. With confidence, he introduces his company and shares his idea of earning money themselves instead of relying on their wealthy fathers. Moreover, he encourages everyone to become the main investors in his company. Meanwhile, Dean hands them a pamphlet detailing their company's strategy, and Joe gives Kyle a check for $5,000, claiming it to be the profit from his $10,000 investment. Instead of questioning Joe's use of his money without permission, Kyle is impressed and invites Joe and Dean to have dinner with his friends later. In the evening, they go to Spago, a restaurant in Beverly Hills. At the dinner table, Dean tries to manipulate everyone with his words and convinces them that Joe can bring them fortune through his stock market knowledge. Meanwhile, a waiter arrives and offers them an expensive wine as a gift from Ron Levin, who is also dining there. Joe and Dean go to greet Ron, who is having dinner with an artist named Andy. Impressed by Joe, Andy gives him a candy bar with his autograph, which Joe happily accepts. Meanwhile, Kyle and Scott become excited and decide to invest $80,000 in BBC, believing they can earn a substantial profit within weeks. They approach Joe and hand him the money. Later, Joe talks with Sydney, an artist, and mentions his investment company. Further, he expresses his desire to connect with people like Andy and asks Sydney to teach him a little about art. However, she responds that she will consider it. The following day, Joe invests the money from Kyle and Scott in the automobile market. He buys luxury cars from Germany and resells them at profitable prices. Then, Joe brings one of the cars to Ron's house to show him the growth of BBC. However, Ron remains uncertain and shares his experiences in the stock market, mentioning his struggles with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Further, he tells that he came out clean during the investigation because he never engaged in any illegal activities in front of the law. Over time, BBC becomes groundbreaking as Scott, Charlie, and Kyle convince wealthy old businessmen to invest in the company. More and more people show interest in investing in BBC due to its attractive profits. Joe and Dean build a luxurious office for their company. Later, Ron visits their office and expresses his willingness to invest in their gold stocks, but he will use his stockbroker and the profits will be divided between BBC and him. Joe is extremely excited and contacts Ron's broker, Mr. Frank, to find out the amount invested with BBC. To everyone's surprise, the investment amounts to almost $4 million. Afterwards, Ron advises them to use this money wisely and calls them the Billionaire Boys Club. They all cheer with joy at their achievement. The following day, Joe attends a meeting at a restaurant and sees Sydney, whom he had met before. He approaches her, and during their conversation, they share details about their lives. Then, Sydney invites Joe to an art exhibition and he agrees to join her. At home, while getting ready for the show, Joe's father questions him about the expensive suits he owns. Joe confidently explains that his company, BBC, is growing big and that he plans to buy a new house for them. However, his father expresses doubt, stating that an honest business cannot achieve such heights so quickly. Joe ignores his father and leaves for the art exhibition. At the exhibition, Sydney seems upset as she has been scolded by her boss. Joe tries to cheer her up by making fun of her boss, and later that night, they become closer and engage in an intimate relationship with each other. The next day, Joe and Dean meet with Ron to discuss their interest in signing a deal worth $250 million with a company called Kojenko, based in Chicago. They inform Ron that Kojenko is in debt of $3 million, and they propose to use the money he invested in BBC to pay off that debt. In the afternoon, Joe attends a conference to persuade the shareholders of Kojenko. He hires a bodyguard named Tim for added security. At the conference, Joe impresses everyone with his speaking skills, and the shareholders agree to merge Kojenko with BBC. After a few weeks, Joe purchases a luxurious house and throws a party to celebrate. During the party, Joe tells Ron that he is struggling and asks about the $4 million he hasn't received yet. However, Ron assures him that the money will be transferred to BBC's account soon. Additionally, Kyle, Charlie, and Scott request their profits from Joe, but Joe diverts their attention by offering them shares in the BBC company. Furthermore, Ron gifts Dean and Joe Rolex watches as a symbol of their success, and they celebrate throughout the night. The following morning at the office, Joe calls Frank and asks him about the final disbursement check. Joe got the revelation that Ron has been deceiving him, using Frank to expose his gold system. It turns out that Frank wasn't Ron's broker at all. Moreover, Ron informed Frank that he is a news reporter working on a story about investing at BBC, and he asked Frank to pretend to be his broker. This allowed Ron to trick Joe by creating a fake account, which he used to secure a $1.5 million bank loan under the BBC name. This makes Joe blame himself for believing Ron, and he also discovers that Ron is facing federal charges in 3 states for bank violations. Later, Joe shares all this information with Charlie, Scott, Kyle, and Dean. They come up with a plan to seek revenge against Ron. In the evening, Joe, accompanied by Tim, goes to Ron's house. Joe reminds Tim not to hesitate to scare Ron into handing over the money. Then Joe enters the house, followed by Tim, who begins to beat Ron. Afterwards, Joe demands the money Ron took as a loan from the bank. Joe presents a check and asks Ron to sign it to save his life. After Tim takes off his mask, Ron bursts into laughter as he doesn't expect to be held up by Tim, who is a doorman. Then Ron continues to provoke them with his words, which deeply offends Tim. In a fit of anger, Tim shoots Ron in the head. Joe becomes extremely panicked and rushes to Dean to tell him the whole story. Moreover, Joe is completely terrified, but Dean tries to calm him down and assures him that Ron deserves what happened. On June 6, Tim and Joe dispose of Ron's body in Soledad Canyon and pour a lot of acid on his face so he won't get recognized. The scene transitions to Joe's house where Dean informs Joe that Ron's check has bounced and BBC is on the verge of bankruptcy. Moreover, he warns that tax authorities will soon come after them, especially if they discover Ron's involvement. However, Joe and his friends try to save BBC and meet Izzy, an acquaintance of Charlie, whose father is a wealthy man. When they meet Izzy, he agrees to invest in BBC, but with the condition that they smuggle his father to Los Angeles. It turns out that his father is an Iranian tyrant with seized accounts, and he believes that by moving to another place, they can bring fortune. On July 30th, Joe and Dean arrange a large trunk to smuggle Izzy's father, but he backs out at the last moment. Dean becomes angry, and during their argument, Izzy's father unexpectedly passes away due to a drug overdose. They decide to place his body inside the trunk and arrive in Los Angeles. Upon opening the trunk, initially they doubt his state, but discover he is alive and wait for him to regain consciousness. Outside the BBC office, investors protest, demanding their investments back. Scott and Kyle, unable to tolerate the situation any longer, decide to leave BBC. Meanwhile, Dean looks after Izzy's father, who is still unconscious. Suddenly, Izzy's father awakens and attacks Dean. Joe comes to Dean's rescue. Then Joe goes to find a rope to restrain Izzy's father, but unexpectedly, Izzy's father tries to call the police. In a state of panic, Dean strangles him to death. Overwhelmed by the entire situation, Joe suggests they report Izzy's father's death, but Dean suggests it's better to dispose of the body without telling Izzy. As Joe realizes that everything is going out of control, he decides to use Izzy's father's money to repay the company loan and start a new life. Later that night, Joe goes to his father's house and asks him to be a witness for the disbursement check involving Izzy's father. However, a few days later, as Joe and Izzy attempt to cash the check, the police suddenly arrive and arrest Joe. Meanwhile, Dean is being investigated, and the truth unfolds. However, Dean, being skilled at manipulating words, shifts the blame for the murders onto Joe, and all the evidence points against him. Joe is considered the mastermind behind everything. Surprisingly, Dean is set free, and Joe looks at him with disappointment, realizing that Dean has betrayed him. Later, Dean becomes the main witness and is included in the witness protection program. Meanwhile, Joe is charged with life in prison for the murders and fraud. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you smash that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications to help the channel out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.